My childhood in a nutshell. PS, PS1, and Nintendo 64.
You are Locked On Fantasy Basketball, your daily podcast on fantasy basketball. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast brought to you by Basketball Monster. And today's Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast is also brought to you by SeatGeek. Download the mobile app for the easiest way to buy tickets and use the promo code LONBA to get yourself a $20 rebate on your first purchase. My name is Josh Lloyd, and as always, you can find me on Twitter at redrock_bball and on Facebook at facebook.com/redrockbasketball. Today's show, it's going to be the first in a series of season preview shows. Some of them will be longer shows with two teams spliced together just because of the way that the NBA season is starting 2 weeks earlier. I don't want to have them running up until like a week before the season goes, because I want to get more of your draft content in there. So we'll have some double episodes, some longer ones. Today's one is just going to be a single episode to kick things off. And what we're going to talk about, or the team we're going to talk about in today's first show of the season preview series, we're going to be talking about the Detroit Pistons. And to help me discuss everything that we need to know, or you need to know, or I need to know about the Detroit Pistons for the 2017-18 NBA season, I am joined by the now former host of the Locked On Pistons podcast, Duncan Smith. Duncan, how are you?
I'm good, Josh. How about yourself?
I'm okay. It's actually nice and sunny here for the first time it's been in a while, just sort of coming out of winter here. So I've got a little bit of sun out, a little bit of warmth. Doesn't affect me because I wear shorts 365 days of the year, but at least I don't have to hear it from everyone else telling me why you're wearing shorts when it's freezing outside. But we're starting to come into our summer. You're starting to get into your winter. So yeah, it's time for us to enjoy the warmer weather. Now, Duncan, as I said, you are the former host of Locked On Pistons. But before we start, where can everyone else find what you're doing at the moment for their Pistons coverage?
You can find me pretty much every day on Piston Powered, which has basically been my base of operations since I started writing about and covering the Pistons. I've also got a bit of an announcement down the road in the next few days, actually, that I can't really get into right now, but it should be pretty exciting for Pistons fans. Basically, though, Piston Powered is where you'll be able to find my Pistons work for now and indefinitely down the road. So that's the best spot right there.
Yep, so go check out Piston Powered for any information. And I use all these team sites all the time when I'm looking at things and talking, especially preseason stuff, when looking at projections to try and get ideas of how people close to the team or who are following the team 365 days of the year, what they're thinking about things, even fan posts, comments, the writers, all that sort of stuff. And it is a great way you can gauge some extra information. Obviously, that I try and filter through that information and put it out to all the listeners here as well. But this is what we're doing in this team preview series, is trying to get these team insiders or team experts to give us that extra bit of information. So, Duncan, this has been a long introduction.
Let's get to it.
Let's get to it indeed. We are talking Detroit Pistons, and we're going to talk about this. I have a sort of a rough structure, I guess, to these shows. We're looking at the players that have arrived at this team, the players that have left, rookies that were drafted, how things are going to play out rotation-wise, and some key questions regarding players who may have underachieved, overachieved, injured last season, where they're heading into the season. Then we'll talk a little bit about fantasy value of some of those players later on, and who I think might be a little bit undervalued or overvalued, where things currently are, where things currently sit. Let's start with the additions. The biggest addition undoubtedly is the arrival of Avery Bradley to the Detroit Pistons, who came across from Boston in that trade for Marcus Morris. As a Pistons guy, Duncan, when that trade happened, I was sitting on a plane. I don't know where I was flying to. I think I was going from Utah to Vegas, and it came through, and I was shocked. I assume that you were shocked as well. There was no inkling of this happening at any stage prior to the announcement, was there?
Not a bit. Yeah, I actually woke up. I think I'm sort of a night owl, so I wake up a little bit later in the morning, maybe than some. And so I woke up about 20 minutes after this trade came down the pipe, and I definitely had to double take, pinch myself, shake, really kind of shake it out and make sure that I was not misreading this trade, because like you said, there was no inkling, there was no kind of rumor, there was no smoke or anything like that about the Pistons doing anything other than intending to retain KCP for hopefully as cheap as possible, but ultimately for whatever price that would take. So yeah, the acquisition of Bradley came in fairly typical Stan Van Gundy mode, where like his big trades, there's nothing, there's no noise, no buzz in advance. It's just dropped on your head, and then everybody gets to kind of put together the pieces around it. So it was definitely out of nowhere.
Now, if you're looking at the trade as a one-for-one, it's a very, very clear win, in my opinion, to the Pistons. Avery Bradley, to me, is a better player than Marcus Morris, but you can't just judge it in that one-for-one, because in order to do that, they had to renounce those rights to Kentavious Caldwell-Pope and lost him. So in the end, it almost ends up being a KCP and Marcus Morris for Avery Bradley, and then bring in some of those other free agents that came in that we'll talk about later. The upgrade is fine there from Bradley to Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, or sorry, other way from KCP to Bradley. I think that is an upgrade in talent, but the overall package of losing Morris as well, do you think that that's a step forward for the team? It's a step backwards? How do you view that across that 2, 3, 4 positions?
I think that it kind of accelerates the timetable for Stanley Johnson. He was partially, certainly in no small part, due to his own play on the floor, his state of mind, his behavior. He did kind of bury himself on the bench last season, but this season, like he's really just kind of getting pushed out of the nest, and it's time for him to like fly or not. So I think that Morris wasn't so good for this team that keeping him around to have him be like basically a guy who for most other teams would be maybe a 6th or 7th guy in the roster. I feel as though like moving on from him and sort of accelerating the timetable for a young guy like Stanley Johnson is probably beneficial. I don't think that Morris was so good from a talent perspective that he was really, this trade coming along, trying to hold on to him in order to keep the whole KCP thing together. It wouldn't have worked for me. Marcus Morris, I think, is fairly, to some degree, overrated. I think in some circles.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, he's like the definition of a light rebounding forward. Now some of that is affected by the fact that he played so many of his minutes with Andre Drummond last year. But I think that he had like a just over 8% rebounding percentage last year. Like some guards, like some small guards have higher rebounding percentages than that. And even without Drummond, he's not especially effective on the boards. He's a ball stopping wing essentially, who's not conducive to ball movement. And he really likes his long mid-rangers a little bit too much. Around here we call him a poor man's Carmelo Anthony. And I think that's probably the best definition. Yeah, very poor. He's 25 cents to Carmelo's dollar, I guess. I think that it might not be fair to call it an addition by subtraction situation unless Stanley Johnson really takes a step forward. But I don't think that his impact will be missed nearly as much as I think a lot of people who view this Pistons offseason poorly. I don't think that his impact will be missed nearly as much as many people do.
Yeah, I agree. What he was basically was a high minutes, high volume guy who was inefficient and did nothing else. Like didn't provide defense. He took a lot of shots. He had a worse true shooting percentage than Reggie Jackson, and Reggie Jackson was killed all last year for just jacking shots and being so inefficient. When Morris ended up being worse. Now, something you did bring up there about playing alongside Andre Drummond, I think that's really key as we go back to Avery Bradley, because people look at Avery Bradley. Avery Bradley, man, he's going to be awesome. He grabbed 6 boards a game last year. And there's a real big difference between playing alongside Al Horford, who grabs 5 rebounds a game, or 6 rebounds a game, and playing alongside Andre Drummond, who's going 14 rebounds a game. Whoever comes and plays next to Andre Drummond, their rebounding slips. Ersan Ilyasova was a guy who could get double-digit rebounds in Milwaukee. He came to Detroit, didn't happen. Tobias Harris was a guy who would frequently get double-doubles in Orlando. Comes to Detroit, he loses 2-3 rebounds per game. The exact same thing, I believe, is going to happen to Avery Bradley. His previous 3 seasons, like last year, he grabbed 6 boards per game. The 3 years before, 2.9, 3.1, 3.8. So I think it's a massive the massive rebounding increase he had was in large part due to Horford not being that rebounder, and now it's going to revert right back as he plays alongside Andre Drummond. So as someone who watches Drummond, is that a real factor that he just inhales everything and no one else is grabbing those boards?
Very much so. I think that some of it's schematic. I think that at least on like those uncontested boards, the Pistons basically just like leak up and get up court, and those boards are left for him. That's sort of a side note, I guess. That's kind of problematic in the fact that like when he gets those rebounds, he does not move the ball quickly. He grabs it and he just kind of embraces the ball, and he really takes his time when it comes to like shipping it off to a guard and getting the play started offensively. So the fact that he does inhale those rebounds is kind of problematic. Like it really slows the pace for the offense, and it kills transition opportunities like before they even get started.
Before we get into any more of these Pistons talk, Duncan, I've got to tell you about today's sponsor of the show, and that is SeatGeek. And buying tickets to sports and concerts, it can be complicated, but there is a better and simpler way to buy, and that is with SeatGeek. SeatGeek is the smartest and easiest way to buy your tickets to whatever event it is that you want to go and see. With SeatGeek's seamless mobile experience, you can buy and sell tickets in just 2 taps. It helps you find the best seats at the best prices, fully guaranteed. I've got that SeatGeek app on my phone. I encourage everyone, I'm sure you've got it on your phone as well, Duncan. I encourage everyone to download that and find themselves some tickets. With NBA season 6 weeks away, the Detroit Pistons opening a new arena soon, Duncan, I'm sure that people will be able to find themselves some tickets for SeatGeek, from SeatGeek for those Pistons games. Now, what's the name of the new arena? It's Little Caesars, is that right?
Little Caesars Arena, yeah. It's owned by Olympia Entertainment, which is owned by the Ilitch family, and that's the family that started Mike Ilitch in particular, who passed late last year, earlier this year. I don't recall which, but he's the guy who started Little Caesars. So hence the name. Rather unfortunate name. So
if we're looking at, if you're going to go buying tickets to this arena, you've got the phone booth in Washington with Verizon Center. What do you think this is going to be called? The Pizza Oven? Like, what sort of name do you reckon we're going to give Little Caesars? Like, what sort of colloquial name do you reckon this stadium will get?
I hope that we stick to something, like the LCA. Just keep it an acronym. Don't.
That's not going to happen.
Focus too much on the pizza. Yeah,
someone's going to pizza.
I'm not embracing the pizza connection whatsoever. I just hope we can keep this reasonable.
We'll see how it goes, but it's very unlikely that's going to be the case. Back to SeatGeek though, because you can get your tickets to go to Little Caesars Arena and see the Pistons in the new season. SeatGeek saves you time, saves you money by searching multiple ticket sites to compare prices and find the most amazing deals. To get the most bang for your buck, it grades every ticket based on value to help you immediately identify the best seats that fit your budget. And best of all, my listeners get $20 off their first SeatGeek purchase. Just download that SeatGeek app and enter the promo code LONBA today. That's promo code LONBA today for $20 off your first SeatGeek purchase. Let's look at some of the other players who have arrived in Detroit this season. No one who's going to be really entering the starting lineup necessarily, but a few guys, one old face, a couple of other sort of depth pieces that have arrived. Anthony Tolliver, who was with the Pistons a couple of seasons ago, he returned. Stan Van Gundy loves him. He fits that mold of a stretch four who's just bombing away from three. We're going to talk about that starting or that power forward position a little bit later, but your memories of Tolliver as a member of the Pistons, do you think he's lost in his step? That was 2 years ago. He struggled a little bit in Sacramento. Do you think he can bring back what he was offering in that time in Detroit when he was there 2 years ago?
I think so. I think that he can eat up some important reserve forward minutes. He can fire away from three. I think he shot 39.1% from three-point range last year. And that's something that this team is really going to need. They shot 33% from three-point range last season. And that's simply not going to cut it, especially when you don't have you don't have like efficient guys who can just get to the basket at will. Reggie Jackson might be the only guy last season who you would think by reputation will be able to do that. And thanks to being hampered by knee tendonitis, he didn't have any kind of explosiveness or burst, and he wasn't able to get to the rim at will. So Anthony Tolliver is definitely going to help fill out the 3-point shooting ranks. The Pistons also had a significant need in the veteran leadership category last year. It's more of an intangible effect or whatever, but something that like a couple of the guys from the team themselves told me that like the team just they didn't have like a dad in the locker room, like a team dad, when things are getting tough, especially towards the end of the season when the wheels just started to fall off and everything just like, deteriorated. There wasn't like this guy who had seen it all, who had been there, been through the trenches, and knew how to sort of right the ship. And I think there's only so much a head coach can do. So Tolliver is that guy. He was that guy 2 years ago, and I think that Van Gundy recognized his error last season in not bringing him back. And it's a year later, but he corrected it in the end.
The question I have about Tolliver is, do you think that he's a every night in the rotation sort of a guy? Because we had Henry Allenson play a little bit in those last couple of games of the season last year and looked much improved in Summer League this year. And ostensibly, they're playing the same role, those two. So is it more of a case of let's maybe start it off with Tolliver or let them battle it out in preseason for that backup 4 or third string power forward role, depending on what they do with Lua and Harris? Or do you think that Tolliver will just have that role most of the year and will still develop Allenson in the G League for the majority of the season?
I think that role is going to be Tolliver's until Ellenson basically wrestles it away from him. I don't know what Stan's plans are for Ellenson regarding the G League. I think he would like to be able to keep him around the NBA team a bit more. But I don't think that he necessarily has what it takes to crack the rotation regularly and necessarily take a lot of minutes away from Anthony Tolliver either. I think that that's his spot until Ellenson like surprises us, and I would myself be very surprised if he was able to like really take a chunk of minutes away.
I'm not sure if you notice this, but every time that I see Van Gundy talk or I see an article quoting him talking about his players, he's we've got 9 starters on this team. We're going to have 12 guys play 25 minutes a night. And every single player he's talking about acts like they're going to be playing major rotation minutes. Oh, yeah, Reggie Bullock's going to be playing. He could start and play 27. And Henry Allenson stepped up. And we've got 9 guys who are capable of doing this. And is it hard to sort of get through that Van Gundy speak of everyone's great? And then during the season, it's everyone's shit, basically. But he's really building them up and giving this, I guess, keeping his cards close to the chest in terms of what he's going to actually do with the rotation.
Yeah, for sure. I think that a lot of that comes from the fact that the forward rotation is not entirely set. We aren't positive if it's going to be like which two of the trio of Stanley Johnson, John Lure, and Tobias Harris are going to start, for example. So right off the bat, you've got 6 starters potentially, but it does kind of ring a little bit hollow because Van Gundy is so very rigid in his rotations. He's not the kind of guy who's going to have like a 9 starters kind of mentality when the season actually gets going. It's not going to be this very widespread situation where a lot of guys are getting a lot of minutes. Last season was a bit of an aberration because you had guys who would be missing time during games. KCP, he only played like 6 minutes in a couple of different games, I think, due to injuries. The Pistons had a lot of blowouts, particularly in the first half of the season, so guys were just not playing like extended minutes throughout the course of the season. So like last season was a bit of an aberration from Van Gundy's his typical MO, where like the same guys usually get a lot of minutes and then everybody else kind of fills in. Last year was a little bit closer to what you might think like a 7 or 8 starter quality type team might do, but it was largely just because of the fact that the Pistons had a lot of weird things happen. They had a lot of blowouts, and the minutes got spread around just kind of by accident.
One of the other guys that signed, who's going to be, I think, a meaningful piece of the rotation, maybe you'll disagree with this, is Langston Galloway, who started the season with the Pelicans, was traded to the Kings as part of the DeMarcus Cousins deal, left there and signed for a somewhat surprising contract. I know I was a little bit surprised by it, but how do you see Galloway fitting in? Do you think that he is going to be Bradley's primary backup? Will he play any situations where he is the point guard, or even though they've got Reggie and Ish Smith, so maybe only in an injury situation? Like, is he in the rotation, especially ahead of Luke Kennard, which, in knowing Van Gundy and his distaste for rookies, I would have to imagine that Galloway is ahead of Kennard for this season. But how do you see him being used this year?
Yeah, I believe that he's going to be primarily the backup too, and he will be basically the third point guard. So an emergency guy, like if Reggie Jackson can't go, or something that I advocated, I guess a month or so ago, is that the Pistons basically rest Reggie in all back-to-backs. So just don't play him in a back-to-back situation, the second game of a back-to-back. And the Pistons have 14 such games this year. So my recommendation, my hope is that he gets all of those games off at a minimum, completely off, and then that would slide Smith into the starting role, and Galloway would play the backup one
And then
in
moves
those situations.
Kennard into the backup 2 role to play those
Yeah,
15 minutes or so there.
correct. Yeah.
Just before we go into the rest of these additions, Reggie Jackson, just remind everybody, what does Stan Van Gundy do with his starting point guards in terms of minutes?
Well, the plan, I think, is going to be to keep a close eye on his minutes this coming season with Reggie. Um, Reggie is never really going to be the kind of guy who can go and play like 35, 36 minutes per game. Like at the best of times, his conditioning is kind of poor. He's struggled with asthma for his entire career. And this is even before like this latest flare up with knee tendonitis, and it's probably a situation where you're going to find Reggie playing fewer minutes than most starting point guards, and Ish Smith playing more minutes than most backup point guards. So you may find a little bit more value in Ish, in spite of the fact he doesn't do a lot of scoring. He kind of does a little bit of everything else.
Yeah, his ability to get assists, Ish Smith, make him a really interesting fantasy waiver wire guy. You need assists. Smith can come in, he could have 5 or 6 in 22 minutes in a game, and there might be a game where Van Gundy limits Jackson to 25, and you get 23 minutes out of Ish Smith, and he gets you 5, 6, 7 assists perhaps in that time, gets some steals, and some okay rebounding. The percentages aren't going to be great, but he can do that. And Van Gundy, traditionally, wherever he has coached, his starting point guards, they don't play more than 30 minutes a night. And you add that with Jackson's knee issue, I don't think he's playing 30 minutes a night this year. I think it's going to be a 29 minutes per game sort of a situation with some games off. Especially with the way that Smith handled things last year. The other guys who have arrived on this team, I don't think they're going to have too much of an impact. Eric Moreland and Derek Willis, and Luis Montero is the first two-way contract. They've got one more space for another two-way guy. If you don't know what a two-way contract is, it's a contract that enables that player to go between the G League and the NBA roster, enables the roster to be expanded out to 17 guys, but those guys on the two-way contracts can only spend 45 days with the NBA team. So it's not 45 games, it's 45 days, whether that's travel days, practice days, game days. They can only be with the team for a maximum of 45 days unless they get upgraded to a regular contract if there is a roster spot, not including those two G League two-way spots. So Montero's barely going to play, and I wouldn't imagine Eric Moreland or Derek Willis would see a huge amount of action unless some of those other forwards get injured.
Yeah, for the most part. I think Derek Willis is probably destined to end up with a two-way contract. I think that's probably his hope and his goal at this moment, actually. The Pistons do have 15 regular roster spots filled right now. I think Willis is the 15th.
Yep.
But they are also planning on only carrying 14. So that would basically signify Willis's like best case scenario if he's going to continue to have a role with this organization, would be to get that second two-way. As for Moreland, he's going to be the third center, and he's probably going to effectively have the Boban Marjanovic role from last year. He'll get some minutes, especially like if there's foul trouble for Andre Drummond, if there are like matchup situations, if there's an injury. Moreland might find himself getting even a handful more minutes than Boban got last year. But you're right. There's not going to be Eric Moreland isn't going to be like a high impact player, most likely for this team.
We've already touched on a few of the guys that have left. Kentavious Caldwell-Pope went to the Lakers. Marcus Morris and Aaron Baines have gone to the Celtics. And Beno Udrih, Darren Hilliard, and Mike Gbinije have been released by the team, so they won't be back. In the draft, Duncan, with the 12th pick, the Pistons selected Luke Kennard out of Duke. And I know I was, but were you surprised at all by his level of play in Orlando Summer League? Or maybe not surprised, but I guess pleased more than anything. Like, okay, he's showing quite a bit here.
I would say I was pleasantly surprised. So a little bit of both. I think we expected he was going to shoot the ball well because that's just what he does. He's an excellent shooter, and I think he shot like 45% from three. At the NBA distance, which is not a surprise in itself because a lot of the threes he took at college, they were of NBA length. Like he's not a guy who's concerned about distance really. So the shooting didn't really surprise me. I was happy to see that it didn't fall off. I think that with the summer league, you just want to make sure your guys don't look lost or underachieve. But he also showed some real craft and creativity that I didn't expect to see out of a 20-year-old. Like he's creative and clever in the way he gets his shots off sometimes, and I think that might actually benefit him. Where like his athleticism may fail at the NBA level, like he's not gonna like just out athlete guys when it comes to getting his shots off. But he's got some tricks in his bag. I remember he released a jump shot with his left hand, his dominant shooting hand, from the right side of his body. I think it was like tie up or take the summer league championship game to overtime, and it was this contorted kind of jump shot that he still made look like smooth and in rhythm. And it's not something that you see a lot of like established NBA guys pulling off, let alone this kid who's playing summer league, which is now the highest level of basketball he's ever played in his life. So I was all on the team Donovan Mitchell bus when the pick was made. I really expected that to be who the Pistons went with, but starting my research essentially as I should have done earlier, but ended up doing pretty much on draft night. Luke Kennard, I think, is a guy who's going to be a pretty good player. He might not be exceptional, but the things that he's good at are things that you need in the NBA, and some of the things that he's not good at, he might end up being better than we expected. The defense is something that Stan Van Gundy was concerned about, obviously. But he has not at any point so far disappointed on the defensive end. Like he looked good in practice. It surprised the Pistons. He looked good, in practice against NBA guys. Like I know Stanley went down, and I think a couple other like regular rotational Pistons went down to Orlando to work out with the guys before the summer league started. And he looked good in those situations. He looked good in practice. He looked good in summer league. Like he wasn't a turnstile, and I think that was sort of what a lot of us were expecting. And that was also something that was going to hurt his ability to get on the floor once the season gets started. So if he doesn't play himself out of minutes defensively, I think that he might be a guy who can really shine.
The other thing with Kennard from a fantasy point of view is he can handle the ball a little bit and he can get some assists. Now it's probably not going to be massive this season, but when we're looking at him long term, the steal numbers aren't ever going to be high. He's not going to be blocking lots of shots. Like he shoots well from the free throw line. He's going to have efficiency. He's going to hit threes. The assist is something that can really increase his value, and I could see times in his career where he's averaging 3.5 assists, which for a guy that's going to primarily play shooting guard, that's not a bad number. So that's something to keep in mind for Kennard. I wouldn't expect much from him this year, maybe even next year, but that's something that he does have to add. He's not just the guy like Nick Young, who's 1 rebound, 1 assist, 0.2 steals, 0.2 blocks. Like he's got that ability to rebound a bit. He's a bit bigger than what you might expect, and he can handle the ball and he can distribute it as well. So that's something that he can add in, but that's going to be for people who are looking 2-3 years down the track. Now, we spoke about Reggie Jackson a little bit in his knee. Do you know anything about sort of where he's at? Are we expecting him ready for training camp? Is he going to be full go for training camp? Look, it's been hard to try and find any sort of information about how that's going, but are we feeling pretty confident that he's going to be ready to go when training camp opens?
Confident is, I'd say, more optimistic.
Okay.
Stan talked about this 2 or 3 weeks ago, I guess, at an event in Detroit. He gave us the lowdown on what has been going on with Reggie's knee. He's been training, at home in LA. The Pistons physical therapist, has basically been living with him this summer, and the approach has not been to do any kind of on-court work, at least as of 2 or 3 weeks ago. The approach has all been about strengthening the joint and the ligaments to really sort of take the strain off of the knee, and take the strain from the pounding off of the knee. So basically, the plan is that hopefully he'll be ready for training camp. It sounds like they're probably going to take it easy in training camp once they actually get started. And so he'll probably, like, he might get a couple days off during camp. He will probably not be doing 2-a-days either. So he might have a situation where he's like still playing himself sort of into game condition once the season gets started.
He's got an average draft position of 114 on Yahoo and 110 on ESPN. And look, there's a chance that he struggles again like he did last season if the knee's not right. But I think at that sort of pick, when you're talking about one of your last 2 or 3 picks, a guy who's pretty much locked in as a starting point guard, there'll be some people who debate that and think, oh, maybe they give it to Ish, which I just don't see that happening in any situation. Yeah, there's no way that's going on. So
if Reggie can go, Reggie starts.
Yep. So when you're picking with your last pick and you've got a guy who can be maybe a top 70 player or a top 65 type of guy, that's the sort of selection you want to make. Then if it doesn't work out, who cares? Like if he comes into the season, his knee's not right and he's taking every second game off, or he's sitting out all these back-to-backs and they're playing him 26 minutes a night for the first 2 months as they work it in, then you get rid of him. But if he's back to being Reggie Jackson and can ignite this team and get the pick and roll running with Drummond and start hitting his shots and not pressing as much as what he was last season, then I think it's a real bargain at that sort of a position. So a lot of people will have this mentality of, I drafted him last year, he killed me, never going to do it again, he's a bum, he's finished. Forget it. You get him at the end of the draft, you see how it goes, and there's a massive chance that he exceeds that easily. There's a chance that he doesn't, but then you get rid of him. You haven't wasted anything. So that's sort of what we're thinking there. We've got to find out what happens. We've got to see how he looks in preseason and if he's actually participating, which we assume he will. But it is something to pay some attention to. The other, I guess, is not really an injury, but Reggie Bullock is going to be suspended for the first 5 games of the season. So we're going to have someone jump into that role. Maybe that gives Kennard some extra minutes to begin the season, even though he's not really a 3 and this team is lacking some 3s. It gives Stan Johnson maybe some extra minutes, or maybe Bullock wasn't even going to be in the rotation anyway. So that is something to remember if you're in deeper leagues, that Bullock is going to miss the first 5 games of the season. Now, the big guy on this team, both literally and figuratively, is Andre Drummond. And people are really critical of him. I'm sure you see it all the time in your writing and comment sections and tweets. And they're very much, I've got to trade him, got to get rid of him. He's a dud. That contract's an albatross. Do you think that the surgery that he had to unblock his septum or whatever it was that he had in his nose to enable him to breathe, is that going to enable him, or do you think that will help him actually put more effort out there and increase his stamina and reduce his fatigue? Do you think this is a real thing that is going to have an impact on Andre Drummond this season?
I am really quite optimistic that it will. I know that there are I've heard some people who have had like deviated septums have talked about like the impact on like athletic effort not being like significant. Like for them once they had their own surgeries and repairs. But the other thing to remember there is like most of these people who are commenting are not like NBA athletes. The training load that they have is in almost all cases much less than anything Andre Drummond is experiencing. And another element in play here is something that a quick shout out to one of my writers at Piston Powered, Shamik Mohil. He did a breakdown of the effects that a deviated septum would have, particularly like the day after like flights. So like back-to-backs where you're playing the second day of a back-to-back after flying, basically. You don't have time to recover, etc., and it really inflames the septum, like the elevation, the flying time, the travel time. And it checked out as far as the numbers went. Andre was much worse in those second game back-to-back situations than he was in like an average game. And I think I haven't done any kind of like film breakdown on this particular thing yet, but I think that we may find some correlation between these possible inflamed games and his lack of a motor. That's something that's always been a knock on him, but he's also never been able to breathe properly as far as like throughout the course of oxygen is an important element to general life, let alone if you're like one of the 416 best basketball players on the planet who are traveling on basically like a nightly basis. So yeah, I'm optimistic, and it's not blind optimism either. I think that from an educated standpoint, I'm looking to see some significant steps forward as far as effort and energy goes. And Andre Drummond is a much better player when he's really bringing the effort. There's a noticeable difference when he's got it one night to when he doesn't the next night, and it might also be noticeable. It might also be notable that sometimes it is that very next night that he doesn't have the energy, and it's just because the aforementioned situation where he just isn't able to get the oxygen in, and what is coming in is inflamed.
So
I think.
He's got the ability to play more minutes if this actually works out, because he's seen his minutes drop down recently, and some of that is potentially due to fatigue or poor play related to fatigue. The other thing we've got to hope that happens, and I'm sure you're going to be with me, is that Van Gundy's got to stop trying to make him into a post-up player. Look, he has been horrendous at it. He has not really shown many signs of improvement, and it's dropped his efficiency in the years that Van Gundy's been coaching. We're talking about a guy who was 60-plus field goal percentage going down to like 51, 52. Is it finally time for Van Gundy to say, you know what, he just doesn't have a post game, just let him roll, just putbacks and rolls, and let him score efficiently that way? Do you think it's finally sunk into Van Gundy that it's just not going to happen?
I hope so. If you look at his post up numbers from last year and the year before, they're so bad, and there's so many of them. He 27.5% last year and the year before of his possessions were post ups, and his improvement is like infinitesimal. Like I think 2 years ago he had like a .726 points per possession from the post, which is unthinkable. And then last year it was up to like .734. It's not even worth commenting on that being like an improvement. And so yeah, I don't think that the post ups necessarily have to come out completely, but like these like 7 to 9 foot turnaround no look hook shots that he is like so fond of, those are what needs to go. Like if he can get deep position, then he can get his post ups. Like, but that's the stipulation though. Like he has to be able to get like within that like 5, 4, 3 foot range for his post game to be worth anything. Like once he can get that ball deep, he's basically unstoppable. He's stronger than almost anybody. He's bigger than almost anybody, and he doesn't use his size advantages properly when he's like posting up and like trying to finesse the ball from 9 feet away. So yeah, I would. My dream has always been, or has long been at least, for him to model himself after DeAndre Jordan. He's a guy who cuts to the rim, he rolls, he doesn't do a lot of this finesse stuff from 10 feet out, and Jordan posts up like 10% of the time rather than 27% of the time, and his post ups are all from like deep position where he's not stoppable. So yeah, that's what I want to see on Andre Drummond.
Since Van Gundy started coaching this team, his true shooting went from 60% to 50%, then 50%, and then 51.8 last season. So it's a massive, massive drop off. And he's posting a true shooting of 60% while shooting 41% from the free throw line in that first season, or that last season before Van Gundy arrived. So that just shows you how ridiculously efficient he was. And then Van Gundy's come in and said, look, we want you to run things differently. We're going to allow you to do these post-ups. And he's going, cool, let's do them. But the volume of them is just extraordinary. The other thing with Drummond is if you're playing in a league with offensive rebounds as a category, he is a dominant offensive rebounder. He's probably the best offensive rebounder in the NBA. He's averaged over 4 offensive rebounds for the last 4 seasons, and that's a significant amount, and he can really be a contributor in that category. He also gets a lot of steals as a big man. He's had 1.5 steals the last 2 seasons as a center, and that's sort of Nerlens Noel type territory. Clint Capella a little bit less, but they're the centers who are getting you those big steal numbers. That's where a lot of Drummond's value comes from. Now, if you're playing in a rotisserie league, do not ever draft him. Like, you can't draft him because of that free throw percentage. It is impossible to do. Well, it's not impossible, but you're in a 12-team league, a standard rotisserie league, don't draft him. In a roto league, you can't. In a head-to-head league, he's a top 20 player because you can ignore that category. You can hopefully get the field goal percentage bump. Your monster rebounding, his scoring should go up if the field goal percentage goes up. The good steals, the good blocks. He becomes a really valuable player, but don't try to do it in roto. It's not going to work, and you need to forget that. And hopefully there is significant upside if you're in a head-to-head league to grab him with hopefully the minutes going up, the fatigue going down, the effort increasing, the lack of reliance on the post-up shots is all going to help him. And I think that he could be a little bit of a surprise packet this season. We spoke about it already, Duncan, the starting forwards, the 3 and the 4. I get the feeling that your preferred starting combination is going to be the same as mine, but I'll ask you anyway. Who do you want to start at the 3 and the 4, or play the most minutes at the 3 and the 4, I guess, for this team during the season?
I've bounced back and forth on this one, actually. I think I'm actually back to my initial thinking that I'd like to see Tobias Harris playing the 3 with John Lure at the 4.
Okay.
And that's how I would like to see things start, because I just have a lot more faith in John Lure to be able to produce than I do in Stanley Johnson right off the bat. I feel like by the end of the season, if things go to plan, I think that Stanley Johnson could supplant Lure's role, and then take over the 3 with Tobias shifting to the 4. That's the benefit of having Tobias Harris. He can play either one. But like right off the bat, I think that I'd like to see Lure taking the 4, letting Tobias play the 3. But I can kind of go either way with that. Like I also would not hate to see Stanley Johnson at the 3 with Tobias at the 4. My main source of concern is that Tobias Harris is at the 4. Well, either the 3 or the 4, but he has to start basically.
Yep.
I think that last year he was the best player on this team by a pretty significant margin, for better or worse. But Tobias was good all season long. He was good. And I think that burying him on the bench again like they did last year would be a pretty significant error on this team.
Well, he was only playing like down the stretch only like 29 minutes a game, which is crazy, especially considering, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, like Stanley Johnson was terrible, and John Lure for the last 3 months of the season was brutal. Like he was really, really bad. And Harris should never have been in a situation where he was playing such a small amount. 29 is not a small amount, but he should be playing 32. He should be playing 33, not giving these other guys. And it's not like Lure's coming out and going, he's playing well, we've got to make sure we get him out there. Like he sucked for the last 3 months of the year. Didn't he hit like 20% of his threes post All-Star break or something? Some crazy amount like that. He couldn't do anything. The season wore down on him. He struggled. Johnson was terrible for the majority of the year. So yeah, I agree. They have to get Harris in, and they have to play him more minutes. Now, I think a lot of it's going to come down to Johnson and what he looks like in camp and pre-season. I actually prefer him with the starters because I think if he's playing with those starters, he doesn't have to have as much offensive responsibility. He doesn't have to handle the ball quite as much if he's going to be alongside Avery Bradley and Reggie Jackson, where if he's in the second unit, maybe he's going to be used more as a secondary initiator, which I guess puts a bit more pressure on his offense, whereas in the starting unit, he can actually just focus more on defensive stuff and grabbing some rebounds, getting some steals, locking down perimeter guys. So that's why I want to see him do that, and then let the offensive game come naturally rather than being forced into more concentration on that end in that second unit. But in the end, it is going to fluctuate, I reckon, between Lure and Johnson as to who gets those minutes, and that could be something that changes every month depending on how they go.
Yeah, I think that's the best argument for Stanley in the starting lineup as well. When he's the 5th starter, he can have like drastically reduced usage, and the other 4 guys are all guys that kind of need the ball anyway. So it reduces the amount of time he has to be kind of featured if he's with the starters. But then on the other hand, I'm just concerned about his ability to play like starter minutes against opposing starters as well. But it's a tough situation where I think it's really going to come down to, like you said, like how Stanley comes out in camp.
Yeah, we just look. If he just needs to hit some shots. Like he needs to come out and not shoot 35% from the field. Like he needs to at least show, if you leave him open, the shot can go in. And I don't think too many people are too concerned about the defensive side of things. They're pretty comfortable with that. It's just he's got to be able to hit a shot. Like he's got to be able to do something to at least not be Andre Robertson out there. He's got to be able to do something offensively, which I think that he can. But we'll see. It's his 3rd season. A lot of players do take that big step from year 2 to year 3, and after a really bad second year, he's going to be obviously keen to get back out there and show something different. Now, we talked about it already. Aaron Baines has moved to Boston, so Boban Marjanovic moves into the backup center role. A lot of people for fantasy are very excited about what Boban can do because his per 36 stats are always through the roof. We saw at the end of last season the numbers he was putting up down the stretch when they were playing him and Henry Allenson more minutes, and he was putting up good numbers there. but I feel that his ceiling is pretty limited. I don't see there's any way that he is cutting into Drummond's playing time unless there are the free throw issues. But again, that was sort of minimalised a little bit last season. We didn't see too many issues with Aaron Baines, closing out all these games over him. So I don't see Boban being able to play big chunks of minutes. Plus, he has his own defensive liabilities with his speed and his lack of speed and lack of mobility. What do you see with Boban this season? Do you think that he can step forward? Could he challenge or take a couple of minutes off Drummond? How do you see him fitting in from what you saw from him last season?
Well, I don't really see him chipping away at Drummond's minutes total. Like last year, I think Drummond played 29 minutes per game. So yep. I think anyway you cut it, he's going to end up playing more minutes this year. I think that the Boban is going to play more minutes this year than he did last year, but I don't think he's going to play as many minutes as a lot of people think.
I agree with that.
And I think that John Lure is going to play a pretty significant portion of his minutes at the backup five, and I don't expect Eric Moreland, like I said before, I don't expect him to do a whole lot, but I think that he'll be able to squeeze some of Boban's minutes as well. If Stan trusted Boban whatsoever, he would have played him in like any meaningful minutes whatsoever last season, but he just doesn't trust his ability to play defense. He's magical on offense, but if you make a move like side to side, if you challenge him laterally, like he's got no shot. His gigantic size notwithstanding, like if you make him move, you're going to put him on skates, and that I don't think that's something that Stan Van Gundy is going to tolerate for extended minutes out of his backup center. So John Lure is good defensively and like significantly better than Boban. I think that Boban's going to be more than a curiosity this year, like he was last year. But I just don't think that we're going to see the kind of extended minutes that people hope for.
Yeah, I'm with you 100% on that. So I think that you can look at his numbers and go, look, he did this on per 36 basis, and it's great, and he's going to play more minutes this year, and that's all fine. But there's literally no ceiling. He's got no high ceiling. Like that's it. Like he's not getting 25 a night. He's not playing 24 minutes and scoring 17 and 9 with 2 blocks. Like it's just not happening. Like he's playing 17 to 18 or 19 minutes. Like that's it. Like there's no upper. You can't go any further higher than that unless Drummond gets injured, and he's missed 3 games in the last 4 years. So that's not a great likelihood of that happening. So I think people are getting a little bit excited on Boban when the upward mobility for him to rise up rankings is just, it's very limited based on who he is. And I agree with you completely. I think that Lure is basically going to be the backup center, and that's going to enable, they'll play some, you'll get Harrison there, but you can get Tolliver in there to get some minutes. Maybe Allenton steps up, and you're going to play some of those lineups with Lure at the 5 and Harris at the 4, and if Johnson steps forward and into the 3. So maybe Boban, instead of being the straight backup, he is almost like a 2.5 or a third string sort of guy as he splits those backup minutes with Lewis. I think people are getting a little bit ahead of themselves with Boban. We know that if he's out there, he's going to score and he's going to rebound, but it's being able to be out there, and that's part of the equation, is being able to be out there for that amount of time. I had a couple other questions here, but we've covered them. We've talked about Ish and Reggie. We've talked about Henry Allenton and Anthony Tolliver already. Who would you say is a breakout candidate on this team?
That's a good question. I am optimistic enough about Andre Drummond that I think that he could take the step forward that we hoped that he would last year. I think that, particularly if Reggie Jackson is any better this year, I think that will help significantly. It'll help unpack the paint a little bit. The pick and roll last year was not as bad as most people think from a Jackson and Drummond standpoint. But if your point guard is just better than what Reggie was last year, which at times was essentially the worst high usage player in the NBA, that's going to be beneficial to Drummond. We can also look at the fact that, in spite of the fact that whether it sounds like an excuse or not, his allergies in combination with the fact that he had like the worst breathing year of his entire life last year, I think that a lot of people think that he took a significant step back last year, and he really didn't. He kind of plateaued.
I agree with that.
Yeah, like if you look at his per game numbers, they're all down. But if you look at his per 36 stats and his advanced numbers, pretty much every one of them, with the exception of points, are like up a touch over the year before.
Yep.
And the points, that's a bigger result of lower usage than anything. And I think that that's not accidental. I think that the Pistons kind of pivoted away from him being a go-to scorer 2 years ago, and kind of threw in the towel a bit last year towards the end of the season. So, he wasn't great. He was mediocre in a lot of ways, but he wasn't nearly as bad as I think the sort of like the national NBA at large viewership thinks that he was. So if he gets some more minutes, if he can improve on a couple things, if his rim protection is like a league average, if he can shoot 45% from three and he knocks the post possessions down to like 15 to 20%, even if they're not more efficient, just those adjustments right off the bat are going to make him like noticeably better, sort of in the eyes of the viewing public at large. And these are all things, maybe with the exception of the free throw shooting, because I don't think that he's better than 40% ever, probably. I've given up on that. But like all the rest of those things are just like really minor little things that if he does, or if he's able to have, if he's able to take effect, that could really kind of project him back upwards in sort of like the public perception, like he was at the end of the season 2 years ago.
Yeah, I'm with you with all of that. That's why I've got him as one of the value fantasy guys on this team. I think that the national perception of him, there's a lot of people out there. There's two settings: GOAT or absolute spud. Like that's it. You're either terrible. Oh, we've got to get rid of this guy. Why don't we just stretch him? Like just stupid. Like just stop saying stupid shit. It's like it's either the greatest, he's going to be a Hall of Famer, or no, we've got to stretch him, we can't pay him this money. And it's never like that. And there's always these explanations. And the things that we've spoken about, and you just spoke about then, like just stop the post-up shots. Like that'll improve your efficiency. Get your health back going. And all this stuff, it's definitely not as bad as what it was made out to be. And he's still going to be a really valuable fantasy guy. And he's probably going to drop 10, 20 spots as opposed to where he was drafted last year. And probably be able to give you a similar, if not improved, performance in those head-to-head leagues, and be able to provide you top 20 value for a guy that you can get at pick 50, or maybe he slides to pick 60. So to me, he is a tremendous value guy. The other two guys that I think are value players here is Stanley Johnson with the last pick. We don't know how that's going to work out, but if he starts and they say, well, hey, look at this, Stanley's taking a step forward, he's shooting better now, he's hitting threes, he's getting a couple of assists, he's getting 1.5, maybe 1.7 steals, maybe he's upping that, then that's a value pick with that last pick. And the other one is Reggie Jackson with one of your late picks as well, because people are going to be swearing off him. But again, a starting point guard who can maybe get you 18 points, maybe get you 6 assists. His steals and threes are never high, but that's valuable right there with one of those later picks. And these are guys, again, it's always, as you said, look at the narrative around these guys, and it's never as clear cut as that. It's never as probably as extreme as that, and people really buy into that Reggie Jackson was disgracefully terrible, and he wasn't great, but there's lots of reasons for it. And if it changes, and like we think it will, then you can get some value there. On the flip side of it, there are some guys who are going a little bit high, like Luke Kennard's getting picked at pick 137. He's just not going to be in the rotation every night. So to me, it's all well and good to take a flyer of a pick with your last pick, but when all things are pointing to him not actually playing every night, that's probably not going to work out. And Tobias Harris, assuming that if he comes off the bench, the minutes going down is somewhat of a concern for a guy that's getting picked at 70. Maybe he then becomes a guy that should be out to 90 or so. But if he's starting and gets back to 32, 33 minutes, then we're talking about, that's sort of spot on where he needs to be. One last thing before we go, Duncan, I want to get you to give us your over-under take on wins for the season. I've got a couple of sources here. I'm going to do this on all the shows. The early over-unders came out in the middle to end of July. We haven't had any updated figures since then, so I'm going to use those, and I'm also going to use friend of the podcast and friend of the Locked On Podcast Network, Kevin Pelton's wins projections as another pseudo over-under. So the original over-under that came out was the Pistons at 40.5 wins, and Pelton has them projected at 35.1. Do you go over-under the 40.5?
I would go over slightly. I kind of have them like at 41, 42 wins. I think that that's also building in some worst-case scenario projections. So I feel somewhat optimistic that they can get 42 even if some things go wrong.
What is worst case? Is worst case a Drummond injury, a Jackson injury again, or a Bradley injury, or is it Harris? Like, which one of those guys is going to mean the most if they go down for extended stretches of time?
Well, I think that last season was basically like a worst case scenario gone completely haywire. Basically, Reggie Jackson was hurt and then came back and was utterly woeful on both sides. Every single player on the team regressed, with the exception of Andre Drummond, who basically plateaued so hard that it looked like he regressed. Every player on this team, I think, with the exception of Reggie Bullock and Reggie Jackson, had like career, if not career low shooting from 3-point range. Certainly, it was like down from the season before. And go figure, like Reggie Jackson had his best, I think it was his best or second best 3-point shooting season last year, but it was the only thing he did like with any kind of capability at all. So I think that if Reggie can't go and they try to play him through it, that would be a disaster. I think we've seen sort of the negative of what happens when they try to play Reggie Jackson through the condition that still is going to basically plague him for the rest of his career. Like, knee tendonitis is chronic; it's not going away. So that is a pretty significant problem. I think that is something that they may have to deal with. But I think they're better equipped with the roster they've built this year to handle that. They've got Avery Bradley can handle the ball. Langston Galloway can handle the ball. Right off the bat, that's a couple guys who can probably handle the ball better than anybody on this team could last year. So I think that they're a bit better prepared to handle worst case scenarios, which is why this fairly gloomy perspective of this team, I think, still gets them like 42 wins, especially in this terrible Eastern Conference.
So they're going to be fighting out for those, one of those 6 through 8 sort of seeds, I guess. Maybe get up to the 5. There's a possibility they push to that. It's I don't think we should be looking too much at everything that happened last year and going, well, this is who they are. I think that they are better than that, and there are a lot of factors that went against them: the horrendous 3-point shooting, the injuries, the disjointedness of starting point guard being out to begin the season and missing training camp and all that sort of stuff. So I think it is interesting, and I reckon if I had to pick, I would say they go the over on that as well, probably at 41 myself. That's where I'd have them at this point. Duncan, thank you for coming on and chatting with me about all things Pistons. Now, tell everyone where they can follow you on Twitter. Any articles you've got coming up that people can check out as well?
You can follow me on Twitter at Duncan Smith NBA, and this project, this situation that I have upcoming that shall not be named, I've got a piece in the works for that that I'm pretty excited about. I think that it's going to shed a lot of light for some about the Pistons offseason, which I think was a fairly interesting and topsy-turvy offseason, to say the least. So that's something that when that drops, I will be broadcasting that out through all my channels, especially on Twitter, to let you guys all know about that one.
So go and follow Duncan over there, Duncan Smith NBA, and when he releases that info and releases that new article, you can check it out and get some more information on the Detroit Pistons and their off-season. You know where to follow me, and that is at redrock_bball. Subscribe to this podcast, and if you do enjoy it, even if you don't, even if you're just listening because you hate me, because you want to sabotage your own life, just give me a 5-star review anyway. That's doesn't cost you anything. On iTunes, you can do it on Stitcher, you can do it on Google Play, you can do it on TuneIn, and the podcast is also now on Spotify as well. So if you do listen to your podcasts through Spotify, you can find Locked On Fantasy Basketball over there as well. Duncan, once again, thank you for coming on.
Thank you, Josh. My pleasure.
We are done. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya. Langston Galloway.